Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Elaine Kub looks at corn and soybean prices. Bryce Anderson talks about the flip from El Niño to La Niña. Brodersen explains how swine producers can prepare for the Veterinary Feed Directive. And Galen Erickson discusses cattle performance in the feedlot. Elaine Kub is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. U.S. corn and soybean exports took a hit in December. Soybean shipments were down nearly 18% from the previous year, and corn exports were 12% lower than December 2014. China was the biggest buyer in beans, taking 60% of the overall total. Mexico was the top importer of corn. It accounted for 39% of U.S. shipments. For the calendar year, U.S. corn exports in 2015 were 10% lower than 2014, while soybean exports were 3% below the previous year. We talked with Elaine Thursday morning about the cost to move grain, the health of the U.S. economy, and recent price movements.
I want to believe that the global economy and that all of the commodities have sort of established their low, like that February 11th timeframe. There was basically every market hit some sort of a temporary low or a long-term low on that date and has been rising since then. So, I mean, when we talk about concerns about supply of a crop, we talk about a risk premium for high prices. I think what we have been experiencing in commodities, and grains have followed along, is a fear discount. So to the extent that global investors may have been selling commodities and selling markets based on that fear, maybe they were selling the rumor being concern about China demand, particularly in their manufacturing sector. They sold the rumor and hopefully they're buying the fact. So hopefully we've established some bottoms and we can continue to recover a little bit, or at least stay steady.
We'll get your thoughts on selling strategy towards the end here. Today the USDA released its long-term projections to 2025. Anything striking in there that you saw? Well,
I thought it was a good document, again, to remind us to not panic, that the global economy is still expected to grow. China is still expected to grow, maybe not by 8 or 9 or 10% a year, but more like 5% a year. So those were the baseline assumptions that USDA made, but it still is not going to result in $7 or $8 corn for U.S. farmers. I mean, price-wise, they're looking, this is basically it. They are looking, because of this challenging profit environment, they did make some projections for lower acreage, so to go from 257 million acres for the 8 major field crops down to 250 million acres by 2017. So that's not even a pie in the sky 2025 thinking or 2060 thinking. That's fairly near term. They're expecting to see some acreage come down because of this low profitability environment.
Right, and the major declines there coming in wheat, corn, and cotton. You wrote on DTN this week about the cost to move grain. Tell me just how cheap it is.
Well, and I get trouble when I use the word cheap, because when we're talking about moving grain by rail across the country, I was reminded that the tariffs have not really fallen. It's that secondary rail freight market that has fallen. We're no longer, really scrambling to find the cars. And this is primarily a story due to lower coal movement, both within the country and outside of the country on the oceans. It's the ocean freight rate that really made headlines recently. The Baltic Dry Index, which is the index that tracks that ocean freight prices, that hit a low, again, on February 11th, kind of that critical date for these markets, based probably more on supply than demand, but also there's some fear in there too of lower demand for coal and oil and all kinds of commodities moving across the oceans.
Right. Does it allude at all to any threats of the U.S. or overall world economy?
Absolutely. Again, I mean, there's fear here. The last time that the Baltic Dry Index was even close to this low was that 2008 Great Recession. I mean, that was when global credit availability dried up. I mean, there was just nothing able to move. So you see those prices again, and you really start to worry about global economic activity. And crude oil is the same way. You see crude oil below $30 a barrel and you worry, I mean, is there just no demand for energy? But in both of those cases, it's probably more related to the supply. In USDA's grain transportation report, they also emphasized the supply of capacity to ship grain. The Panamax vessel capacity has increased by 51% since 2011. So fortunately, this is probably more of a bearish supply story, which is good for grains. If we can transport it more cheaply, that makes prices more efficient both to the producers and to the end users.
We've been tracking the strength of the U.S. dollar. Tell me where it is now.
Well, fortunately, it fell through the first part of February. I mean, it had about a 5% drop in the first few weeks of February, and it has recovered since then alongside all of these other markets that have been slowly recovering since that February 11th date. So it's strong. It's much stronger than our competitors' currencies, which is unfortunate for our exports, and we do see that in those long-term projections from USDA. They're expecting the dollar to remain strong. But fortunately, it's not the major threat to commodity prices as it was even a month ago.
All right. Based on what you're saying today, what do you think could be a realistic target for some sales in either corn or soybeans?
Well, a realistic target would be anything that can make you money. And I'm afraid we're probably not there, especially in environments where cost of productions are very high, like the irrigated acres in Nebraska. I mean, you look at the insurance guarantees that are being averaged through this month, it's something like $388 for corn and $887 for soybeans. That's a 2.3 to 1 ratio for soybeans over corn. Maybe soybeans don't have to bid as much because they're a lower cost to put in if you're worrying about the size of your operating loan in this year. I don't expect to see a major rally. I mean, I think I expect to see a typical spring rally, something happen sometime during the planting or growing season where we might juice these markets up a little bit. But if you reach a point where you can make money selling the grain, I think, let's not be too greedy this year.
The U.S. Drought Monitor is painting an extremely favorable picture across the Corn Belt. The Midwest region, comprised in part by major growers like Iowa, Illinois, and Minnesota, has its best conditions since May of 2002. Nebraska, located in the Monitor's High Plains region, has put together a perfect 2016. The state hasn't recorded a percentage in any intensity of drought so far this year. But would a switch from El Niño to La Niña drastically shift huge growing regions into dangerously dry conditions? Earlier this week, we talked with Bryce Anderson at DTN's offices in Omaha to learn about the potential transition. We started by asking Bryce to give an update on current moisture conditions across the Midwest.
Well, the situation for moisture is really favorable. You look in the key producing areas of the Corn Belt, basically from central Nebraska all the way east to Indiana, and then from Minnesota south into the Ohio Valley, and the soil profile is just about full. That's a mixed blessing because obviously we're going to have moisture to work with when springtime hits. On the other hand, it's not going to take a whole lot of rain to cause soils to get saturated and then to get muddy and hard to work with.
How concerned are you about a delayed planting season?
I am concerned that that's going to be a big feature this spring, particularly in the western Corn Belt. The way the pattern is shaping up, it looks like from central Iowa on west through Nebraska that the temperatures are going to be near to below normal, which is a cool spring, but also throughout the Corn Belt during springtime, it appears that the precip is going to be near to above normal. So that's basically a cool and wet spring, and that brings along with it planting delays. And we have seen this now in 5 out of the past 6 years. The only year recently that there was not some kind of a problem that way was back in 2012, and that was when it was terribly dry.
Do you expect anything abnormal in the way of temperatures this growing season?
Well, I think temperatures are first of all going to show a little bit different character than we've seen the last 2 seasons, because it looks like temperatures are going to be near to above normal, and definitely above normal over the eastern corn belt during the growing season. So that would be a lot different than what we've had the last 2. And along with that, when we get into the heart of the season, into the fill stage in mid to late summer, there's a lot of variability in the precipitation. The western and the central corn belt, including Nebraska, has near to borderline below average precipitation, and then there's a little wetter trend for the Ohio Valley, that southern corn belt. With that kind of variability, I think that we could see some stress develop there. And so as a result, I think that trendline yields for corn and soybeans are probably where we're going to max things out this year. That doesn't mean it's going to be a crop failure, but I don't think we're going to be setting the bar into a new area like we have seen over the last couple seasons.
How do you expect El Nino and the end of El Nino to affect corn and soybean growers this season?
Well, the Pacific is starting to cool, but it's very slow, and it looks like we're going to still have above normal sea surface temperatures going into the middle part of the summer. El Nino will be with us through the spring, and then for the summer, the way the forecast models are presenting things now, we will have neutral conditions with the waters in the Pacific not really showing any tendency to cool into a La Nina fashion until probably well into the fall. With that going on, that's a generally favorable situation for the Midwest when we look at the overall planting and growing season.
Can you explain that transition from El Nino to La Nina? Does it always happen? Why does it happen?
The transition from El Nino to La Nina does happen. Why it happens is the evolution of the ocean, because deep, slow-moving but consistent waves in the subsurface of the Pacific go back and forth, and during the end time of an El Nino, those waves interact and start to take away from the large pool of very warm water that we have in the equator region of the Pacific. And eventually then that's what moves into a La Nina with cooler water.
Is it a given then that we will transition into La Nina this year?
I think that we will. By late summer, we'll start to see things happening, and then into the fall is when it appears that these cooler temperatures, La Nina conditions, will indeed develop. And you know, if that takes place, it would be good for harvest, because La Nina would be a dry weather maker for harvest. But as we think about next year with La Nina in place, that could be a year of some stress caused by that.
Yeah, that's the question. Should growers be concerned about La Nina, both what it means for the U.S. and for Brazil and Argentina next season?
I think that it's going to be an issue that's going to get more and more attention, because there's a very high relationship between El Nino and above average rains in Argentina and southern Brazil, which we have been getting. And on the other hand, there's also a very high relationship between La Nina and below average rains in Argentina and southern Brazil. If Argentina sets up, let's say in November, that's basically the month of May in South America. And so any moisture stress would start to show up in the South America growing season for 2016 and 17.
Later in the show, Nebraska Extension's Al Dutcher will give his forecast for weather conditions in the state for the next week. A few weeks ago, we explained how the Veterinary Feed Directive would require livestock producers to receive authorization from their vet to use medically important antibiotics in feed and water. On Wednesday, the Nebraska pork producers held their annual meeting in Lincoln, where Ron Brodersen described the coming changes for those in the pork industry. Ron is the current president of the American Association of Swine Veterinarians and practices in northeast Nebraska. We talked with Ron at the Marriott Cornhusker Hotel here in town and began by asking how the use of antibiotics in the swine industry would change with the VFD.
There are some medically important antibiotics that are going to be limited in their use after January 1st. Currently, though, most feed antibiotics are used at the discretion of the producer. And so after January 1st, most antibiotics used in feed will have to be prescribed through a veterinarian, through a product or a instrument. It's going to be called a Veterinary Feed Directive, and it will bring the veterinarian more closely involved with the usage on the farm.
Are veterinarians having to go through extra training for this VFD?
No, but through the American Association of Swine Veterinarians, which I am an officer at this time, we have programs in place to assist veterinarians to keep them up to date on what is happening and what's new.
So walk me through a scenario. Producer walks into his barn, he finds a problem, he wants to administer an antibiotic. What does he have to do?
Well, there's two aspects. One is that there are some situations for prevention that a VFD issued for a farm will be in place because they anticipate a problem, but then there's going to be emergency situations that come up where there's an urgent need, and at that time the veterinarian may have to visit the farm. If it's not a situation that they're not already familiar with, there'll have to be a farm visit, some diagnostic work, or some diagnostic evaluation to justify the use of the antibiotic, and at that time then the Veterinary Feed Directive or the prescription order will be written and issued to both the feed supplier and to the farmer, and then there'll be a documentation or a paper trail for all those types of usages.
Tell me about the accountability, the liability here and kind of the checkup of how this whole system is supposed to work.
There's added responsibility now for both the farm and the veterinarian, and as well as the feed mill, in that there will be required a veterinary client-patient relationship where the veterinarian is familiar with the farm and the health program of the farm. And so there's some responsibility for the veterinarian to know what's going on before he can write that VFD. But at the same time, there's responsibility, more responsibility for the farmer or the producer or the hog grower to follow the directions that are on that feed directive.
What do you think producers need to be doing now to prepare themselves for January 1st?
The first thing would be talk to their veterinarian, make sure that they have a veterinarian involved, and so that there's some communication so that things are in place before January 1st through communicating with the veterinarian, and so that the veterinarian knows which feed mill to work with for that producer.
To learn more about the background of the Veterinary Feed Directive, you can view our interview with Kansas State University's Mike Apley from the January 29th episode of Market Journal. It can be found on our website. The University of Nebraska-Lincoln's 2016 Nebraska Beef Cattle Report has been released and is available online. It contains research results from numerous UNL studies. At the Beef Feedlot Roundtable in West Point, Nebraska last week, we talked with Galen Erickson about several topics contained in this year's report, starting with a look at how cattle perform over time.
One of the things that's important for producers to know, especially as we start to look at whether we should make cattle bigger or market them early, is what is performance doing, especially at the end of the feeding period. So we've been very focused on how does fatness change, but most importantly, how does carcass weight change. And what we've noticed is that everybody's in tune with the idea that cattle sort of drop off as they get bigger and bigger. And that's true, except when you measure carcass weight, they sort of continue to grow and grow and grow. And so last fall we saw very big cattle because producers have realized that cattle continue to put on carcass weight. So to know when's the optimum time to market, we got to quantify how that performance changes over time. And so that's really been a major focus for us. We have a lot of ongoing research as well as some new research in the beef report.
So that closing out the feedlot time then, is that counter to what you would normally think?
Well, especially cattle can be marketed multiple ways, but especially when cattle are sold on a carcass weight or dressed weight basis, making them bigger tends to make the individual who owns those cattle more money. And so it goes against sort of the conventional wisdom in the old days is well, cattle as they get bigger sort of tail off and it's just smart to get rid of them. I'm not sure that's the case today if you're selling on a carcass weight basis, which by the way we would recommend everybody do because it'll long term make you the most money.
One of the other focuses in the report is the use of residue in Nebraska. What are the ways that you find most valuable to using residue here?
Well, this is a major research and extension education area for us, primarily because we think residue is such an untapped resource if we're smart about how we use it. And so we have a lot of work on sustainable use of residue. There's really three ways. Grazing residue, which is an excellent way, probably the best way to use it because cattle harvest the best stuff. And so backgrounding cattle, certainly cows grazing, works great till we get a lot of snow cover or ice, but it's still our best use. Second would be harvesting as corn silage, harvest the plant and the grain at the same time. Large focus area for us. Year in, year out, it's one of our most inexpensive sources of energy for growing and backgrounding cattle, maybe even for higher inclusions in finishing cattle. And then the third way would be harvesting those residues as baled stalks, et cetera. And that may sound like it is probably the lowest quality way, but we're working on ways to upgrade that quality and still fits for a lot of people to feed low inclusions.
Nebraska is also the second largest producer of ethanol in the country. One of the products that comes from that is distillers' grains. Is it priced to a position where it's very usable for Nebraska cattle producers?
Depends on who you ask. You know, we were frankly, from 2006 to 2011, our message was feed as much distillers as you can get a hold of because you were buying it at quite a reduction relative to corn and it's worth quite a bit more than corn. And it was no-brainer. That's why we were recommending it. Now our recommendation is to be smart about it. And so if I know exactly what your corn price is and exactly what your delivered price is on distillers, we can optimize the inclusion. And we have tools available online that will allow producers to do that for themselves. Unfortunately, even at the prices we see today, it's frankly a smart move to feed at least 15 to 20% in the diet on a dry basis, primarily as a protein source. The other benefit I would say, especially for backgrounding cattle, is the type of protein that it's providing is the type of protein that we are short on and we require. It's called bypass protein or rumen undegradable protein. So unfortunately, even today's prices, yes, our inclusions are lower than in the past, but it's going to ebb and flow, just like all markets, including the cattle market. So you just want to be prepared to capitalize when it is a smart move.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to the 2016 Nebraska Beef Cattle Report if you're interested in finding more information. The February Nebraska Farmer says it's been almost a year since Jim Macy was hired as the director of the Nebraska Department of Environmental Quality, and he's been busy. He's attended meetings with livestock and environmental groups and held listening sessions at locations around the state. This month's magazine says in addition to meeting one-on-one with producers, Macy and his staff have been working to streamline sectors of the permitting process to make it more predictable and transparent. To read more about the new director's plans for the future, you can check out the February Nebraska Farmer. Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension Associate State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. During this last week, the only significant weather that we really experienced was during the weekend. We had a couple of frontal boundaries pass through the state, increased our wind speeds, and dropped a little bit of light flurry activity across extreme northern Nebraska. But the primary emphasis for the precipitation was in the Dakotas and Iowa, where we actually did see some blizzard conditions temporarily with the frontal system that passed during the Saturday night, Sunday time frame. Now, as we go through this next 7-day period, we are looking at a couple systems moving through once again this weekend, but overall it looks like a dry pattern set up for the state of Nebraska for this next 7-day period, which actually is pretty good news when you consider how much moisture we received over a substantial portion of the state earlier in the month. We've been very wet now for the better part of the last 3 months, and we could use a few weeks of drying to at least get the surfaces dried up enough so that when we do start to see the precipitation return, at least we can handle some of it without seeing extreme runoff. That being said, there is some evidence within the models that as we get toward this last half of this month that we will see the cold air return to the eastern United States as the upper air trough deepens. But in the same token, some very active weather moving in the western United States. So at some point, those two areas are going to merge, and that looks to be in the central United States, and we'll see whether or not we can generate some significant storm activity as we move into the late part of the month into early part of February. Otherwise, let's take a look at the upper air models. As we go through this next 7 days, you'll see the first system that's going to move through is going to occur through today. This system will rapidly move toward the Great Lakes. we'll see a little sag in the jet stream toward the south, but it looks like at the surface we will only see a 4 or 5 degree temperature change as the system pushes the cool air to our region, and then the main activity in terms of precipitation stays well to our north. As we go to tomorrow, you can see that system moves over to the Great Lakes. There's another piece of energy that's going to try to dive down the south side. This looks like it's going to be focused more on northeast and potentially east central Nebraska with a few sprinkles at the most. More often than not, we're going to just see cloudy conditions. There's just not a lot of Gulf moisture that's going to return with this. It's going to be more coming at the moisture source is going to come out of the Pacific, and of course the frontal boundary moving out of the central portions of the prairie regions of Canada, which is a very dry area. Now as we go into Monday, we will see the system sagging just a little bit more, and another piece of energy looks like it's going to dive through this, but it's going to break up as it comes over the mountain, so there's not going to be a lot of moisture associated with this. Best opportunity for precipitation will be across the extreme western part of the state in the Panhandle region. And then as we go into Tuesday, these models currently drive the cold air well to our south. Under the scenario, we see much colder conditions than have temporarily been forecasted, and the models seem to be emphasizing this cold air push. I think it's overdone. So we're going to be cool on Tuesday, but we're not going to be exceptionally cool. We're still going to be a degree or two above normal for most of the state, primarily in the low to mid 40s, with the outside chance for some sprinkles developing across northeast Nebraska. And then on Wednesday, we start to see the ridge trying to build in, so we bring some warmer air back into our region, but yet another push of cold air looks like it may be on the way as we get into late Thursday, and then here it comes Thursday. The cold push toward the Great Lakes may actually push a little bit of cool air back toward our region, but overall, again, we're still looking at very nice conditions. And on Friday, we continue the same trend as the ridge starts to push this upper air trough well to our northeast. Now, in terms of the 8 to 14 day forecast, next Thursday, the following Tuesday, with that ridge building in, above normal temperatures looks to be in the cards, and we will look to see an absence of precipitation. More importantly, the new long lead outlooks for the month of March are in, showing a strong trend for above normal moisture, particularly western Kansas, western Oklahoma. And as we get into the March through May forecast, once again, we see the above normal tendencies for the Central Plains.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, El Nino and La Niña, the VFD in the pork industry, and cattle performance. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Next week, we'll discuss U.S. pork trade with John Hinders from the U.S. Meat Export Federation. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.